Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today we have a very special interview with Professor Andrew Bacevich. We'll be with him in just a second. I want to introduce our co-host, Daniel McAdams, who is our chief editor of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, nice to have you with us today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good.
And welcome, Professor Bacevich. Great to have you.
Well, thanks very much.
Good. This should be a very exciting program for our listeners. I'm delighted, Professor, that we could get you on the program. I came across what you were doing, I think it was in 2005 when I was still in Congress, and Daniel and I talked about your policies, but it was a delight for me to find somebody that had academic experience and military experience that was talking a different tune than what we were listening to in Washington and all the deception. And it was at that time I came across your book, The New American Militarism, which I found fascinating, and then I knew we had an ally in trying to bring sanity to the Middle East and to all our foreign policy. But today we're going to be talking about your newest book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, which is very appropriate because that's an ongoing war, and I think you date the catastrophe over there from 1990 on, since there was a major shift in attitude and a so-called recovery from the Vietnam syndrome, where we were supposed to be a little bit more cautious. But Professor Bacevich is a retired colonel. He's a Boston University professor. He's written extensively, as I pointed out, about the book that I mentioned in his new book, plus many articles. But Professor, I came across another article just recently in the Nation that I found interesting because there's a little bit of politics in it, but it was also very educational. And that was the article you wrote on Ted Cruz embodies the degeneration of foreign policy conservatism. And of course, Cruz is not in the campaign, but I'd recommend that article to our listeners because there's a lot of foreign policy reality in that. But I do want to welcome you to the program today, and we might start off by just giving us a brief update and outline of your newest book, and then we'll see if we can get some questions in and discussion.
It sounds great. Briefly, I guess I'll begin by suggesting that my new book connects to that book from 2005 that I called The New American Militarism. That book made an argument that the American people generally, but especially policymakers in Washington, had become infatuated with war and had taken on a dangerously exaggerated expectation of what American military power can do. If you then fast forward to the new book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, it is basically a narrative that shows what have been the implications of American militarism. The new book recounts in detail all of the American interventions, large, small, protracted, brief, in the Greater Middle East, beginning in 1980, when Jimmy Carter's promulgation of the Carter Doctrine touched off, in my judgment, the militarization of U.S. policy in that part of the world. So we've been engaged in this effort to shape, to use a Washington term, to shape the Greater Middle East using American military power for going on close to 4 decades. It hasn't worked. In my judgment, it won't work, and I think it's time for the American people to take stock of this larger military project and recognize that it's failed so that perhaps we can consider an alternative.
Professor, you talk about Carter's 3 mistakes in your book. The second mistake you bring up was, of course, the support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion, which, as we know, led to Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and everything that followed. And you do talk a lot about Zbigniew Brzezinski, who likes to view himself as the architect of this policy. And I'm sure you've seen this. There was an interview that he supposedly gave in the 90s where he was asked if, in retrospect, it was a good idea to give arms to what became future terrorists. And he sort of brushed it off and said, what's more important in history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire, freeing Central Europe or a bunch of ragtag Muslims? Well, look, just a few years later, just the hubris of the militarism of people like Brzezinski is just startling.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, to emphasize a point that was part of your remark there, and that is that the support for the Mujahideen in the 1980s, people that Reagan was calling freedom fighters, is suggestive of one of the themes of this war for the greater Middle East, and that is Washington's repeated failure to anticipate the second-order consequences of using American power. And those second-order consequences end up being the things that end up really biting us in the tail. Now, with regard to the Brzezinski remark, I mean, you know, Brzezinski's worldview is one that was shaped by the Cold War, and in a sense, he's right that if you look at the U.S. support for the Afghan Mujahideen in a Cold War context, then it does appear to have been a very successful policy. But that's not the only context in which the policy should be evaluated. And the other context is how that supposed success, which led to failure, was an early contributing factor in drawing us ever more deeply into this region, leading to a whole succession of decisions by later administrations, somehow persuaded that the adroit use of American military power is going to fix the place. And we haven't fixed Afghanistan, we haven't fixed Iraq, we haven't fixed Libya. I could go on naming countries. The reality is that the use of the application of American military power in this region has, for the most part, made matters worse at enormous cost to ourselves and at even greater cost to the people that we're supposedly liberating from oppression.
You know, Professor, I want to touch a little bit on how we approach our problem and how we change people's minds. And one thing I'm fascinated with your experience is that you're in academia. And I work on the assumption that most bad things in government are a consequence of things that happen in academia. And whether it comes from neoconservative experts or whether it comes from fascism or these other things. Matter of fact, I think we've lived with a form of mercantilism for a long time because we're after natural resources. And you say it's a little bit more than just the military-industrial complex, and also a little bit more than just us anxious to keep oil. But you do mention a little bit about you know, the information that people get. And is this something that works in your thought? Do you think highly of the politician that, see, I was in Congress for a long time. I've experienced it, but I think I knew what was to go on and I knew what to expect. But so often I think the concentration is on an individual politician and their position versus the philosophy that's coming out of the universities. And that's why I think you're in a position to play a very important role in changing people's minds.
Well, I don't think that I'd put as much. There are some deeply flawed ideas in wide circulation that contribute to our general inability to evaluate U.S. foreign policy in a realistic and pragmatic way. I'm just not sure that the ideas necessarily come from universities. I think the core ideas predate American universities, and one of those core ideas is this overarching notion of American exceptionalism, that we wish to believe that we are history's chosen instrument, that the United States has some special providential responsibility to remake the world in our image. This is a deeply pernicious notion in my view, but it's one that is constantly reiterated by politicians, by newspaper columnists, by talk radio hosts, and the American people have been so propagandized by this notion for so long that they have, I think, lost the ability to think critically about what history is and how history works, and what indeed are the responsibilities of the United States, which are far more limited than seems to be the case given the rhetoric coming out of Washington.
You know, I think that's a good way to point it, and I think you place your emphasis slightly different, but I think your point is probably correct. Ideas do originate in different places. It seems to me like some of them gain their cover and their expertise by those ideas infiltrating our universities, because I know that's true when it comes to banking regulations and banking rules and monetary policy. Mm-hmm. But I think Daniel has another question here to follow up.
Well, I think it's fascinating, your discussion of propaganda and how propaganda really prepares the battlefield, starting in the hearts and minds of American people. Just look how we got into this ISIS war. We all remember it hasn't been that long ago. The media was relentlessly pointing out ISIS as the worst thing ever. The horrible things they did were incomprehensible, and we were relentlessly pounded with that. And then the question was, well, should we go after them or not? Was the issue. So you either fight or not. And I saw a recent interview that you did in Boston where you made this very, very, very good point, which is the use of the American military against ISIS and whether there's not another option.
Well, I think there are several points to be made here. One of them is, and you, I think, have already made it, is that this notion that ISIS poses an existential threat to the United States of America is utterly, completely, and totally bogus, and therefore the hysteria about ISIS is counterproductive, to put it mildly. I think ISIS does pose an existential threat to the countries in the region, that is to say, to Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Turkey, and therefore it is incumbent upon those countries that are threatened to set aside their differences with one another in order to focus on this transcendent threat to their survival and their well-being. But to propose that countries in the region are capable of solving their own problems is, of course, implicitly to suggest that the United States should lower its profile, should back away, should recognize the extent of our failures thus far. And there are very few people in Washington, in either party, who are willing to engage in that kind of self-critical evaluation.
Professor, you talked about there are generally two options. One where you could have a policy where there's policy of what we call containment, and the other one choice is to crush. And you said they picked the worst of the two by combining them, and they're sometime in the wishy-washy middle. So obviously I would think that you're more in a category of diplomacy and containment or something like that. But if you were to advise a presidential candidate, would you pick and choose over this? Would you entertain the thought? The libertarian ideas are probably a little bit more than you might like, but it seems like the other option might be that we don't work for containment as much as just divorce. We want to contain our liberties here at home because we believe that under war conditions is a ripe time for our civil liberties to be destroyed here at home. So I don't know which position there that you would sort of push your presidential candidate if they would sit and listen to you. I know one thing, you could improve any one of them, their foreign policies that we're looking at today.
Well, when I say contain, first of all, again, to emphasize, to begin with a realistic appreciation of the threat, with a realistic appreciation of the interests that we have in that region. Back in 1980, when Carter did promulgate the Carter Doctrine, at that time, there was a strong perception that the American way of life was dependent upon access to Persian Gulf oil. Here in 2016, we know that's not the case. That there's plenty of oil and natural gas right here in the Western Hemisphere. Probably defending Canada and Venezuela should take priority over defending Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So again, we begin with the realistic appreciation of threats and interests. And when I say containment, what I really mean in this case is defense. 9/11 occurred. in an immediate and tactical sense, it occurred because the federal authorities hadn't bothered to establish even minimally adequate security for American airports. And that enabled 19 thugs to hijack 4 airplanes with horrible consequences. So I think the cornerstone of American strategy with regard to Islamic radicalism should be to ensure that our domestic security agencies, I'm talking here about the FBI and the TSA and the Coast Guard and border security, that our domestic security agencies are properly resourced and properly led in order to minimize the likelihood that bad guys are going to be able to penetrate our defenses and conduct attacks. I don't claim that we would be 100% successful in doing that, but again, the threat is not that great, and it's something that can be managed. And to emphasize, I think that approach would be more likely to serve the well-being of the American people, to keep us safe, far more likely to do that at a lower cost than continually engaging in armed intervention in the region. That's what has cost us so much, and that's what has produced all these unanticipated and negative second-order consequences.
Right.
And on that same topic, Professor, you wrote a piece in Politico last month that I feel contained one of the most compelling arguments for your case and our shared case, really. If you don't mind, I'll read just a little bit from that, but I'll also provide you with the neocon response to your statement and then see what you would say to them. You make this excellent point. He said, pardon me, you say, why has the world's mightiest military achieved so little, even while absorbing very considerable losses and inflicting greater damage on the subjects of Americans' supposed beneficence? To that, I would say the neocons would say, well, you got to understand, Professor, it's because the military has had its hands tied. We have not done enough. We have not put enough military in there. We've never tried hard enough, and that's why. It's not that it doesn't work. We've just never really tried it.
There you go.
You know, it's funny. I was in a meeting the other day. Among the participants were 2 former officials of the George W. Bush administration. One of them had been a senior official in the State Department, the other one in the National Security Council, and we were talking about some of these matters, and their position, these former Bush people, their position is that what went wrong was that we left Iraq too soon, and therefore all the blame for the situation right now, in their view, is to be laid on President Obama. And I asked them, I said, well, you know, we stayed in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, and I said, you know, how long would you imagine we would have had to remain in Iraq in order to achieve our purposes? And without batting an eyelash, they suggested that it probably would be somewhere between 25 and 50 years. Well, exactly. I mean,
they never ask where the money's coming from.
It becomes so preposterous that you almost don't even know how to respond to notions like that. Especially when the claim that somehow staying longer will ultimately result in success completely ignores the fact that our presence is so often a source of instability and violence and anti-Americanism. But they are oblivious to those realities. Quite frankly, just as in this bizarre conversation I had with these people, just as they are oblivious to the thousands of Americans who've been killed in the greater Middle East, the 10,000s of Americans, tens of thousands who've had their lives broken and shattered as a result of involvement in war, the hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars that we have expended to no purpose whatsoever, and quite frankly, the even larger number of people, of Iraqis and Libyans and so on, who we have killed in the course of these unnecessary and failed wars. And they are utterly blind to those realities as they promote their, well, we just need to try harder line of argument.
Well, Professor and Daniel, I think the three of us have not learned our lesson, because Vietnam taught us to save a village, you got to destroy the village, and that's what we're doing. We're still destroying. We're not saving very much, and we're destroying a lot here at home. I did want to question a little bit about strategy on how we should spend our money, which I don't think we have much of. And this foreign policy and foreign adventurism hurts us economically here at home. But we work with coalitions in the Congress, always hoping to build an anti-war coalition, which was mildly successful, but not really. We didn't stop the onslaught, as you, Professor, tried to warn us about Iraq. We worked hard on that. But a lot in that coalition, which would be more in the progressive era, they would say if we just spent the money for sending them foreign aid and sending them food and sending them clothes would solve the problem, and because they didn't like the war, but they thought this would be our solution. Now our opinion was that that's a dream too, because sometimes when you send money, bushels of money, or food, it becomes an issue of those who are in power, and they can use it as a weapon. Where do you come down on that? Do you think at times that you can head off military operations by granting more financial aid and foreign aid to these various countries?
Well, I wish you could, and if that were feasible, I'd support it. The problem is, and I'm not by any means an expert in development, but it just seems to me that when development occurs, when countries move from being impoverished along a track leading to some form of shared prosperity, that the sources of that tend to be organic. They tend to be internal. Maybe there's some amount of help that outsiders can give once things are moving in the right direction. But I reluctantly have to conclude that these deeply torn and dysfunctional countries, particularly the ones that we have been engaged in militarily over the last 30 years, that the notion of simply giving them money or of sending U.S. agencies to fix things tends not to work. I mean, again, I wish it would work, because then we'd have an alternative to war. Gosh, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan has been issuing some remarkable reports about the level of money, the amount of money wasted in trying to develop Afghanistan. I think Washington ignores these reports, but it is a fact that we have now spent in constant dollars more money trying to fix Afghanistan than we devoted to Western Europe in the Marshall Plan after World War II. Mm-hmm. And the Marshall Plan actually did make a significant contribution to the recovery of Western Europe, in my view. There is no evidence that the money we've spent in Afghanistan has had a similarly positive effect. So it's just been more waste.
Daniel.
Well, I'd like to, after all the gloom and doom, maybe say something hopefully with a little more positive of a note. You know, the neocons would say our position of restraint, of not looking to a military solution for every problem, signifies not only weakness, which invites our enemies to attack, we all know the story, but also signifies an anti-military kind of mindset. But I would just point out, and I'm sure you've heard this, Professor, that back when Dr. Paul was running for president, he got more contributions from the U.S. military than all of the other candidates combined. So I think we should probably take a look at how the military is voting with its money and what kinds of policies they're voting for, and maybe we can take something from that. Maybe there is some hope in the people that are actually there and seeing what's happening.
Well, I share that hope, and I do get a considerable number of emails from serving military people, and believe me, I've been out of the Army so long, these are not people I know, that suggests an awareness, I think, in the ranks of serving soldiers, that this path that we have followed is a wrong path. It's not going to end well. And quite frankly, I think this whole business of supporting the troops, beyond simply rhetoric, I think that the principal responsibility that citizens have with regard to supporting the troops is to ensure that the troops are not subjected to abuse, to ensure that the troops are never sent into harm's way, except for purposes that are genuinely essential to the well-being of the nation. And the wars in which we have been engaged in the greater Middle East have not been essential to the well-being of the United States, and they've also been incredibly mismanaged, both by the civilian leadership and the American and the military leadership. And what Americans ought to be angry about, I think, is the way that our soldiers are being subjected to abuse by the people who are in charge of policy, and that ought to change.
Professor, we need to finish shortly, but I do have one more question. This has to do whether or not you'd be willing to expand a little bit about our relationship with the Saudis and how the Saudis participate in the chaos there. And if you will, you might even bring Israel into this issue, and whether we have to deal with these problems as well as the Palestinians, whether or not we can even bring ourselves out of there, because it looks like the pressure to be very much involved in those areas seems to me just about impossible because of the influence on our U.S. Congress.
Well, I mean, George Washington and others in the generation of the founders were quite emphatic in insisting that in international relations, in foreign policy, there was no such thing as friends. That nations have interests, and where those interests coincide, it is possible to collaborate and cooperate. But it's also very important, if you're going to have a coherent foreign policy, to recognize when interests diverge. And it seems to me quite clear that the interests of the United States and Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, and the interests of the United States and the State of Israel, on the other hand, have long since begun to diverge and to sustain the pretense that Israel is a close friend of the United States, and the pretense that Saudi Arabia is a worthy ally is utterly counterproductive. We are dishonest with ourselves, and you can't have a sensible policy when you can't even admit to the reality that's staring you in the face. That doesn't mean that Israel is our enemy or should be our enemy, or that we should go to war with Saudi Arabia. We should simply acknowledge the fact that they do things that are harmful to the United States of America, and we should say that out loud, and we should do something about it.
Oh, very good. We want to close here mostly by emphasizing your new book. I think the audience will be very interested in getting a copy of this, America's War for the Greater Middle East. And although I confess I have not read it, I read the preliminary book, and I intend to follow up and do my homework. But I certainly want to thank you, Professor, for being on the air, and I hope we can do this once again.
I'd enjoy that very much. Thank you.
Well, very good.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for being with us, and I want to thank our audience for attending, and please come back soon.